Hello and welcome back to yet another video. I was originally going to have a snarky quip there about the fact that this video is now 2 months late. However, for whatever reason, I could not seem to deliver that particular quip, and so I gave up on it. It's the Nirvana video, finally. We're talking about Nevermind, 30 years and 2 months after it came out in September of 1991. Nirvana are a very interesting band for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest, for me at least, is the fact that they became the biggest thing since sliced bread after the release of this album, and yet they never really seemed to want or be able to handle that. And when I say handle, I'm mostly talking about Kurt Cobain. I think Dave Grohl handled it fine.
I just go out and have fun and I play drums.
And honestly, I don't know about Chris. It's kind of the story of grunge as a genre on the whole, at least after the breakthrough in '91. You have these bands playing these catchy, great songs that understandably took off and were popular. And yet these bands didn't want to be famous on the level that they were. And so a lot of these groups, their later history is all about trying to get away from the fame, which makes this album so interesting. Because I'm going to put this out here, right now. This is a commercial album. This is certainly true relative to the two Nirvana albums on either side of it. Bleach is a raw, unproduced slab of late 80s underground rock. Whereas In Utero, or at least the 75% of it that wasn't trying to satiate the label, feels like a freaky, messed up experience deliberately tailored to alienate all the casual fans. Which brings us back around to Nevermind, which has the most accessible verse-chorus-verse structures of any Nirvana album, and which I believe at one point during its production process had the working title of Sheep, which, you know, maybe that tells you what Kurt Cobain thought, maybe it doesn't. When I was writing the script, I thought that the commerciality of this album was going to be something that I was going to harp on much more, but I actually don't have that much to say about it, so I'll close with an anecdote that a friend of mine provided. He felt that Nevermind was as much of a pop album as Dangerous by Michael Jackson, which is an analogy that I see where he's coming from, but I don't entirely agree with. But anyway, let's actually talk about the music. So Nirvana, in general, are kind of the Pixies too. They borrowed the whole quiet verse, loud chorus thing from them. Kurt Cobain was heavily influenced by a lot of the people in the late 80s West Coast underground scene. But I think one of the least discussed elements of Nirvana is the Beatles and 60s pop rock more generally, especially on this album. There's a certain melodic thing that this album does that those 60s Beatles songs do. And I don't necessarily mean like the critically ensconced classic rock Beatles either. I mean like the She Loves You, Yeah, 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 early 60s pop Beatles. Anyway, I have rambled enough, I think, in this intro. Let's get to talking about the tracks. Realistically, I think most people who are going to watch this video know exactly how Nevermind begins, so I'm going to dispense with the thing I normally do where I'm like, the album opens up with a sweet, soft guitar riff, and move on to actually just talking about Smells Like Teen Spirit, which is, of course, a great, great song. Incredibly catchy, still honestly pretty omnipresent in culture to this day. I know that some of the band members expressed a certain amount of resentment towards the song during their period of superstardom in the early 90s. But honestly, I think when the chips are down, when all the laughter dies in sorrow and the tears rise to a flood, it's probably going to be what the majority of people will remember Nirvana for, and I cannot believe I just made that reference with a straight face. If I were an actual musician, I could probably tell you a little bit more about how this song is actually put together, and in fact, a friend of mine did once actually show me that. But as I am a foolish man, I do not remember what exactly he said. But along those lines, this is rather infamously one of those nicked a riff songs, although interestingly, most of the people I've talked to about this don't really agree about what exactly the riff is that's getting nicked. The most common example I hear people say is More Than a Feeling by Boston, off of their album Boston, and that is two 70s MOR references in one song review. Wow. I've also heard some people say that it's a bit like Blue Oyster Cult's 1977 track Godzilla. I hear that a little bit less than I do Boston, but I think there's a point to be made for them both. And really the final point before I move on to the next track, because let's face it, talking about Smells Like Teen Spirit is done to death, is, of course, the lyrics. They're somehow both more and less incomprehensible than they sound when you don't have them in front of you. The album, semi-infamously, does not have a lyric sheet. There's just a sort of incoherent word salad of little bits from all the songs. And it was to the point, again, during the pre-internet era of greatest prominence for Nirvana, when Weird Al made an entire song parody about this song, where the topic is, in fact, how incomprehensible the lyrics are. Yeah, this is a great track. You all know this is a great track. Apparently, it was another one massively overplayed at the time. I've even heard some people say it's massively overplayed now. I've heard this one out in the wild less than Come As You Are and Lithium, but more than some of the other tracks on the album. What's always really interested me about it is the lyrics, because this album is, of course, the moment that grunge, blew up, became this massive thing for the next 2 or 3 years. And yet, already at this point, we have a song that is about the band not being happy with all of these meatheads coming to their shows and not understanding their message and what they were about. The more I think about it, the more I realize it's just kind of an obvious extension of Fame, but by the same token, it's interesting. Come As You Are is another fantastic song. It's probably the second track I ever remember hearing by these guys, and apparently it's the one they thought was really going to be the big hit that would break them through to a more crossover audience. But ultimately that didn't wind up happening, although the song was, of course, huge, and still is to this day. It's a much more obvious case than Smells Like Teen Spirit of a song that steals from another song. In this case, the main bit is very similar to both the track 80s by Killing Joke and also Life Goes On by The Damned. Breed is a short, fast, aggressive punk song, probably based in large part around the brief relationship Kurt Cobain had with Toby Vale of Bikini Kill in 1990. It and the one other song on the album in this style are interesting in that Nirvana are definitely the most punk of the sort of grungy bands from the Pacific Northwest that became super popular in the early 90s, which I've always liked because a lot of 90s rock, it has the punk attitude, it maybe has the punk look, but you listen to the music, and the music is something else. It's like Pearl Jam, who sound in a lot of ways more like a 70s hard rock band, or like, I don't know, this is just drawing names out of a hat. The Ben Folds Five, who, they have punk songs, but other times they just sound like a jazz trio playing rock. So something that I haven't mentioned yet, but I definitely needed to, is that most Kurt Cobain lyrics, broadly speaking, fall into one of two categories. You have songs that are definitely about something. Maybe we don't know what that is. And then you have songs that are just sort of strings of poetry put together in a way that almost seems like free association at times. Although I'm sure there was more effort put into that, and upon further reflection over the last second and a half, I realized that perhaps that is not what free association means. But anyway, Lithium is another phenomenal track. Again, great bass and guitar, on-point drumming from Dave Grohl. Polly is maybe the last song on this album that really is permeated into the cultural consciousness, and it's also one of the tracks on here that sort of bucks the quiet loud trend a little bit in never actually getting that loud. Lyrically, it is definitely one of the most horrific Nirvana songs, largely because, as a lot of people probably know, it was based on a real abduction and torture that happened in Washington in the late 80s. Which is notable, I think, because there's a track on the next album that is very similar to this one in a lot of ways, has a similar subject matter, but I don't think has quite the same level of shock value. This is one of those tracks that I like but don't always remember, except for the fact that it begins with this brilliant mockery of Get Together by the Youngbloods. Although it is kind of interesting that I don't remember the rest of the song often, because I actually think it's really good. It's basic punk, very similar to Breed, but it gets more and more frantic and unhinged as it goes along, to the point where by the end it's just indecipherable screaming. I've always thought that Drain You was a very strong track. In fact, I would almost go as far as to say that if you somehow played me this album in isolation, removing all the context, the fact that it was a hit, the fact that Nirvana exists, if you played this to me in isolation, I think I would tell you this is the song on the album that I thought was going to be a hit. And yet it kind of wasn't. I mean, it got to number 44, it charted okay, did better than Lithium's, but nowhere near as well as Smells Like Teen Spirit. And from what I can tell, it's not one of the best remembered songs from this album, which is a shame because it's very, very strong. Hook is extremely strong, and I like the way it breaks down in the middle and goes into this almost noisy section for a little while before once again returning to the beginning of the song. A distinctive choice that communicates the intention of the band while also being relatively accessible and conforming to established pop song structures. This is the track on the album where I think you hear that 60s beat rock influence the most. Although that chorus, there's an entire subset of 90s and 2000s rock that comes out of the chorus of this song. And it's something, and it's the kind of thing where I don't have a name for this stuff. Off the top of my head, I can't even really give you any examples. So you're going to have to trust me on this one. It's true. It's true. This is another one where I don't know if I would have said it would be a single, but I'll put it this way. This could easily have been a lesser band's one hit. Stay Away is yet another fast-paced punk song. Lyrics kind of indecipherable, at least to me. Maybe they have deep and profound meaning. If they do, enlighten me in the comments. But this is where I want to take a little moment and praise the drumming on this album. Dave Grohl is a very interesting kind of musician because I don't think I would call him one of the great drummers, but by the same token, he is one of the great drummers. I think I would probably compare his place in Nirvana more than anything else to like Ringo and the Beatles, in that he's not going to blow your mind, he's not going to expand your horizon of what his instrument can do, but by the same token, he is exactly where he needs to be. The drumming on every Nirvana album that he's on is exactly what it needs to be. I don't think you could drum better on these songs than he's doing. This is an interesting song to me. I feel like I've said that 15 times throughout this video. Because it is simultaneously a very good song, but also probably the one I would cut if you gave me the choice, which I recognize is a little bit strange because there are two short punk songs on this album that are more or less interchangeable with each other, and while I like them both a lot, if you're going to cut something, those are maybe the songs you should cut. But I don't know. There's something about this track that has never really resonated for me, even though I really do like some aspects of it, like the way it fades out. The album ends with a melancholy downbeat track, Something in the Way, lyrically seemingly about the narrative that Kurt Cobain lived under a bridge for a period of time while being homeless. Something that, and I could be wrong about this, but from what I read in my research, most Cobain biographers kind of discount. You know, they say he was homeless for periods of time, but he probably didn't live under a bridge. And like I said, I really like it. I really like the strings. It has a very somber and even gentle atmosphere that contrasts, I think, very well with the aggressiveness of a lot of the album that precedes it. And also the noise rockin' that closes out the album, Endless Nameless. Honestly, one of my favorite things on the album, even though from what I understand it's not on certain releases of the record, which is interesting to me. I'd also be interested to know what it looks like in streaming versions of the album. I'm sure probably it's its own track. During the CD era, people really liked to do hidden tracks in such a way where you would have just like 10 minutes of nothing. And that's kind of what happens here. They also like to do like 99 tracks, or in the case of Tool, 69 tracks. Or in the case of Mercury Rev's first album, where, you know, the 99 tracks are also little pieces of an instrumental, which does not work at all when you put them on the computer. There's like a millisecond skip and it just messes up the entire process, and it's bad. Don't do that, folks. If you have a CD player and that's how you're listening to CDs, that kind of thing is fine. It's okay, but if you're doing digital stuff, don't do that. Don't do that. It's not good. You know, it's kind of funny. When I started planning for this video, I really genuinely thought I was going to have a lot more hot takes about Nevermind than I do. Because actually, after having listened to this for like 5 months straight in preparation, I kind of agree with the mainstream hagiography of this album. I mean, maybe not to the extent that I think this is like the best album of the 90s. There's probably like 10 or 15 albums I would reach for before Nevermind, including its eventual follow-up album. And that's just in rock music, never mind hip-hop or electronica. But I do think that it has earned its place in history. I think perhaps there's a case to be made that it is a little overrated, but in the way that anything that is included in the registry of rock music classics. I really only have two major critiques to make about this album. The first and the most obvious is that, like basically every other Nirvana studio disc, this thing is way front-loaded, and that's always been something that I've never particularly liked. I like albums to spread the singles out throughout the entirety of their running time. For the most part, Kurt Cobain did not subscribe to that philosophy, and so Nirvana albums are the way Nirvana albums are. And the other critique I have really plays into that. This album can sometimes wear a little bit thin on some listens towards the end. Otherwise, I have to say it's a very good album. I do know people who dislike it, and there are valid reasons to dislike it, even if I don't particularly subscribe to any of them. But in my opinion, at least, this is a very, very strong album, which is something that this conclusion has been attempting to say at great length, because I really don't have anything else to say about it. And on that note, I will see you all later. I don't really know what the next video is going to be yet. At some point, I am going to review the rest of the Nirvana albums, but I want to wrap up the Peter Gabriel Genesis videos before I really start thinking about that. So that may be a project more for January or February, but anyway, I will see you all later. In case I don't get a video up before the end of December, have a very happy denominational or non-denominational, religious or non-religious holiday that you choose to celebrate around the time of the winter solstice. I will see you all later.